The Alberta budget will be released next week, while the province simultaneously finds itself in the midst of a controversy with Alberta Health Services, plus differing opinions about the Premier's trips to Washington, D.C. And here to discuss all of this and a whole lot more is legislative correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, welcome. Welcome back. Thanks for joining me again today.
Always happy to be here.
Wonderful. Okay, the government of Alberta is finding themselves embroiled in a major controversy over contracting at Alberta Health Services. And the short version is that the former head of AHS has sued the government, alleging that she was fired from her job as she was about to report on serious misconduct during the contracting process for private surgical facilities. So since then, Premier Danielle Smith has stood by Alberta Health Minister Adriana LaGrange and ordered a full investigation. But there are some cracks showing in cabinet. So Tyler, what are these cracks?
Well, the main crack that's showing is that Peter Guthrie, who's the infrastructure minister, reportedly wrote to his cabinet colleagues last week and said that LaGrange, the health minister, should step aside for the duration of any investigation into what's going on here. So there's some sign that internally the government is a little bit sort of rattled by this. As you'd sort of alluded to, it is rather complicated. The gist of it basically being that it's alleged that there was pressure put on Alberta Health Services to sign contracts for private surgical facilities, the private facilities publicly funded, and that there's pressure to sort of pay above market rates basically for these contracts. And so that's sort of the beginning allegation, and everything else sort of stems from there. Where was the pressure coming from? Who was involved? Who may have been benefiting from this sort of thing? And then, of course, the head of AHS went to the board of AHS. They said to take the information to the RCMP, according to the statement of claim filed in court here. And then the board and the head of HS were all fired. So it's a really messy, complicated scandal. The information is coming out, primarily through the news, primarily very slowly, as reporters sort of get drips and drabs of information here and there. But it's certainly been a major story the last couple of weeks in Alberta, and it's linked, of course, to this much longer running drama over the $70 million for Turkish pain medication. So there's a lot going on here, and as I've alluded to, really complicated. But certainly, it is one of the first big scandal maybe of Premier Danielle Smith's time in office, and so it's been interesting to see how they're navigating all of this.
Yeah, exactly. Some people are saying it's the biggest scandal ever in Alberta's, political history.
Well,
Danielle Smith saying that she knew nothing about it and she read about it in the newspaper. So yeah.
Look, I mean, we've had some good political scandals over the years. I mean, it could end up being the biggest scandal, but I mean, the Sky Palace was a rather big one too. The fraudulent manifests on flights and all that sort of thing. We've got we punch above our weight perhaps when it comes to dramatic political scandals.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on here. Next Thursday, Tyler, marks the release of the provincial budget. The province had hoped for a modest surplus going into 2025, but it's unclear right now if next week's budget will be a deficit or a surplus. So Tyler, what do you think? What are some of the indicators that we could see it going either way?
Yeah, so the last budget update, I think they'd forecast about a $4.5 billion surplus, which, I mean, that's an unbelievable amount of money if it was in either of our pockets, but it's not really that much money from a government budgeting perspective. And so it's not totally clear if that surplus will have vanished, if it'll have shrunk. And, the annual budget making process is generally made challenging by oil prices. If oil prices are really good, there's a lot of money coming in from resource royalties that can then be spent on various things. If it's been a bad year for oil prices, then the province tends to head towards a deficit. So that's sort of the open question here right now is what has the price of oil been doing for the past year, and how is that going to sort of be reflected in the budget. Now, so I would suspect either a modest deficit or a modest surplus. I don't think we're going to see a colossal deficit. I don't think we're going to see a huge surplus. It'll probably be a pretty steady as she goes kind of budget would be my hunch on it. and won't, I think, see the tax cut. In 2023, Premier Danielle Smith, well, she wasn't Premier at the time, but in the election, when she was leading the UCP, she promised an income tax cut for Albertans. It'd be about, I think, $750 per person per year. That I don't think we're going to see. I mean, the budget is probably just too tight to reduce the government revenues from income tax, because, of course, resource revenues, it's a lot of money, but the bulk of the money the Alberta government brings and is still coming from the pockets of individual taxpayers. So those would be my hunches. We've seen a few other glimmers of what's going to be in there, some sort of school construction kind of stuff in Edmonton and Calgary in particular, but not a whole lot of hints just yet. I think we might see some more reporting on that, some more leaks, things like that over the course of next week before Thursday. But I don't expect any real dramatics next Thursday.
Yeah, we'll wait and see there. Last week, the provincial premiers, including Danielle Smith, were in Washington on a trade mission, and they ended up securing a meeting at the White House, and the premiers declared it a success. Tyler, do you agree?
Well, to some extent, yes. I mean, it was a success in the sense that they did get a meeting. They certainly met with other people around Washington. They were presenting a united front on the part of the premiers. It was not a success in terms of who they met with. They did secure a White House meeting, but I believe it was with, the Deputy Secretary for Legislative Affairs or something like that. And if you put that in comparison, that same day, Canada's ambassador to Washington met with Howard Lutnick, who's Trump's Commerce Secretary. So, they weren't meeting with a particularly senior official at the White House. It doesn't hurt to get the message out. It doesn't hurt to, build some of those relationships. But the outcome of that, of course, was that this official had said that they didn't agree that Canada would not become the 51st state. So, whatever happened sort of in that room, in that meeting, certainly the U.S. is still and U.S. officials are still, sticking to the Trump line on this, broadly speaking. So I don't think any of it has been particularly unsuccessful. Danielle Smith's been down there quite a bit in the last few months, meeting with various people, and she would argue, I think, that she had secured a reduction in the tariff on energy products, because that, of course, was originally going to be 25% all products across the board when it was announced a couple of weeks ago. Trump said, well, 10% on energy, and Danielle Smith certainly tried to take a little bit of credit for that. So I don't think any of it has been unsuccessful, particularly, unless you think that there is some sort of problem with the premiers individually or collectively pushing their interests in Washington, while the Canadian government, its diplomatic staff, are trying to do the same thing simultaneously. And there is the possibility that those two kind of objectives are at odds. Are they saying the same thing? Is there a consistent message? Are the premiers, offering up, concessions or concerns that the Canadian government would prefer to be kept under wraps, those sorts of things. So it's certainly been it's been very controversial. I mean, Alberta's diplomatic push in the United States, Danielle Smith's diplomatic push in the United States, has been very, very controversial outside of our borders, outside of Alberta's borders, I should say, not Canada's borders. But I don't think I would say it's been, totally unsuccessful.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there's never anything wrong with building those face-to-face relationships. And I had heard that Smith actually met with the Interior Secretary, Doug Burton, he's important in the oil and gas industry. So maybe he could be a key influencer down the road. But never anything wrong with building one-on-one relationships across the border there. Okay, so the Alberta government has raised hundreds of thousands of dollars by auctioning off special hunting licenses in the U.S. Tyler, can you explain what this is all about?
Yes, there's basically a handful of licenses every year that are sort of subject to a ministerial exemption from some of the hunting regulations in Alberta, primarily time of year rules. Like, you can't hunt certain animals at certain times of year unless you've got one of these licenses, and so they're auctioned off at sort of conservation hunting kind of conferences in the United States to raise money, and that money then goes to conservation projects here. And so in this case, there was about $350,000, I think, or $390,000 raised from a series of auctions for some moose licenses. Turkeys were on the list. deer as well, things like that. And then actually the big one that made a lot of money was $400,000 for a bighorn sheep license. So that was the animal that Hunter. This is at a separate auction from the other sort of grouping, but all in, I think raised about $900,000 this year, and that'll go towards conservation. And it does sort of vary by year. It's an auction, depends how much people are willing to pay. Other years have brought in more money, but certainly it's controversial in the sense that the UCP's sort of overall stance on changes in hunting regulations and trapping regulations have been controversial, but otherwise not particularly notable. Other than that's a good chunk of money.
Right. Yeah, no kidding. And the province is still developing its province-wide plan for passenger rail service, but Transportation Minister Devin Dawson has hinted there are some interesting policy ideas coming on how to improve transit, especially in rural Alberta. So what are his ideas, Tyler?
Well, we don't know. The government's been pretty tight-lipped about it. One possibility is certainly some sort of bus service to small town in rural Alberta, because of course that has diminished since Greyhound pulled out in 2019, I think it was. And there have been other private operators that have filled that space to some extent, particularly sort of in the, maybe Lethbridge, Calgary, Red Deer, Edmonton, Fort McMurray kind of corridor, Grand Prairie as well. But of course, if you're in some of those other communities, it's a little bit harder to access sort of transit infrastructure. So the rail plan is generally really interesting because there's been a lot of talk over the past 30, 40 years about expanding Alberta's rail network. And there was actually rail service between Edmonton and Calgary at one point. The Dayliner used to run between the two cities until I think 1982 or something like that. But Daniel Smith is quite enthusiastic about the idea of having a rail transport plan all around the province that would link airports with municipal transit services, that would link other communities with those local transit networks, those sorts of things. So this is not like a short or even medium term project. This is years, decades, maybe down the road. But it is interesting that there does seem to be renewed enthusiasm for this. As I say, it's been studied a lot and has never really gone anywhere. But there does seem to be an appetite for it at this particular moment. Although, as we just talked about with the budget, who knows what the finances are going to be like down the road to pay for this sort of thing. So it could all be a bit of a pipe dream. I think that's a definite possibility. But it is going to be very interesting to see when they finally come out with this whole plan, what they are actually proposing and how that would, change the way Albertans move around their province.
Okay. Well, this one isn't strictly Alberta politics, but it does deal with pipelines. So we have Liberal leadership candidate Mark Carney, and he's finding himself in some trouble over remarks that he made recently about infrastructure, including pipelines. So while he was speaking in Kelowna, Carney hinted that he would use some ill-defined emergency powers to get infrastructure built. But then he later told a Quebec radio host that he would not do such a thing as impose a pipeline on Quebec. So, Tyler, it seems that he's saying one thing in English and another in French.
That does seem to be the case, yeah. When he was in Kelowna, he talked about using emergency powers, and ill-defined in the sense that we just don't know what emergency powers he's talking about. Is he talking about the Emergencies Act that would somehow allow the federal government to sort of override, say, Indigenous consultation rules? I mean, that seems really unlikely. So, bit unclear what he is talking about or what he even thinks he's talking about. But certainly he talked about the importance of getting some of these infrastructure projects built. And he has expressed support, for example, for an interprovincial pipeline in Canada. But yeah, and then he was speaking to a Quebec radio host and said, no, I would never impose a pipeline on Quebec. And he was pressed on it repeatedly. And he said, no, never, never, never. So, well, what is he saying? And did he misspeak in English or did he misspeak in French? Or is he hoping that people won't notice? Or does he think those are, non-contradictory ideas that you would sort of push forward infrastructure projects, but, not on Quebec? Maybe you push them through in British Columbia, but not Quebec. I don't know. But this certainly got a lot as getting, attention in Alberta because, of course, Quebec's intransigence, shall we say, on energy projects was one of the factors that killed the Energy East pipeline. It's one of the factors that has stood in the way of liquid natural gas exports in Quebec, that sort of thing. So all of which is to say, bit unclear what Carney thinks. Certainly Albertans are not wildly impressed by his inconsistency on this topic. So I would imagine he'll be asked about it in the future as reporters seek to get a little bit more clarity on it.
All right. Well, the country has seen a lot of snow lately, and including here in the prairies, and it's hard to believe, but there is actually an upside to the serious snow that Alberta has seen this year. And Tyler, explain what the upside is besides great skiing, of course.
Well, basically, just that the ground is going to be wet. The ground will be wet. The forests will be wet. When all of this melts, it's going to be a wet spring. And that means that it's going to be probably a less devastating, less dangerous, less risky wildfire season. And that's what Alberta wildfire officials have been saying. Wildfire season usually starts pretty early officially in the province. And this snowpack is really something that gets us off to a good start to wildfire season. Obviously, the wetter it is, the harder it is for fires to start. And after the Jasper fires, I think the state of the forests and the wetness of the land and the wetlands and things like that is very much a part of what everyone's thinking about.
Yeah, okay. It looks like we're out of time here, but Tyler, thanks so much for joining me once again today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That is legislative correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson.